partial government shutdown is dragging on with little progress being made after that weekend meeting between the other day between President Trump, Chuck Schumer, and the new House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, followed by yet another marathon White House news conference.
I just want to check that the shutdown could go on for months or even a year or longer. Did you say that? And
I did.
Is that your assessment of where we are?
That. Absolutely, I said that. I don't think it will, but I am prepared.
You ran your campaign promising supporters that Mexico is going to pay for the wall and that the wall was going to be made of concrete.
Very nice question, so beautifully asked, even though I just answered it.
You didn't answer.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Guy Benson, political editor at Town Hall and a Fox News contributor. Susan Faricio, chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. And Capri Cafaro, a former Democratic state senator who teaches at American University. Guy, Nancy Pelosi got a wave of positive press in reclaiming the gavel. Big story. But are the media implicitly accepting her argument, the Democrats' argument, when they passed the two bills to reopen the other 6 government departments except for Homeland Security?
Yes, but in this case, it may not be unfair, and I'm chagrined to say that. I think typically when it comes to government shutdowns and these types of funding fights, reporters tend to lean to the left. They sort of just stenographers for the left, and they challenge conservative views and talking points. That didn't work last time for Chuck Schumer when the Democrats were clearly responsible for the shutdown a number of months ago. This time around, though, what Pelosi's doing, and she's shrewd in this case, she's saying we're just going to pass what the Republican Senate passed a few days ago. And
when President Trump was willing to go along with a no-wall funding compromise.
Exactly, because Mitch McConnell would not have brought that bill up if the White House didn't give him the go-ahead. They did, and then the president changed his mind. So I don't agree with them on substance, the Democrats, when it comes to immigration, but the media, I think, is treating this relatively fairly this time because it's a smart, normal, sort of constructive play by Nancy Pelosi.
Susan, you're on the Hill. Beyond the initial honeymoon, first female speaker for the second time now, are reporters holding Nancy and Pelosi and her party as responsible for the partial government shutdown as President Trump and his party?
No, but they are asking harder questions, I think. There are questions on the Hill about, well, wait a sec, aren't you willing to give any money for wall funding? But I think, look, what's being missed by everybody in the media is what the true fight is about, which is not really money. It's about what's the compromise between a wall and no wall. And the Democrats are sticking to the point of not allowing any kind of wall. So you could make the argument that they are the ones who are not compromising, where the question is often posed, well, Mr. President, you're the one who's not compromising here. Republicans aren't compromising. That's not necessarily the way it's really happening.
Capri, Susan sort of anticipated my next question, which is that this has become a highly symbolic fight, important to both sides' political base. And reporters know that. And the president, by the way, spoke this morning against reporters before leaving for Camp David. And he said the money we're talking about is very small compared to the potential returns. And yet I see most of the media blaming President Trump and not both sides for inflicting pain, including the growing pain for those 800,000 federal workers who are going without paychecks for the moment.
Right. I mean, and I think this goes back somewhat to Guy's point that, particularly those that are in the mainstream media or the more left-leaning media, what they're basically saying is, look, President Trump agreed to, this continuing resolution. He was for it before, he was against it. So if he was going to agree to it before, what changed? And I think this is the interesting thing from the media perspective, because many on the left are saying, you know what changed? The fact that the conservative media stepped up and said, look, President Trump, you shouldn't back down on the wall. And all of a sudden now Democrats and folks on the left are saying, President Trump, you're now governing because this is what Ann Coulter told you to do, what Rush Limbaugh told you to do. So what is the media's role in President Trump's decision-making, I think, is an interesting
He's actually been really consistent. I don't think the media's done a very good job of covering that. He's said all along, I think he's made it very public. It's right there on Twitter. Just scroll through the history of his Twitter feed. I'm not going to sign a government funding bill unless it has wall funding. I want the wall funding. I think he reiterated that over and over. Republicans put the bill forward anyway. It was never guaranteed he would sign it. Never.
But there was an understanding. And now, of course, we're debating is it walls and fences and steel snaps.
I don't recall there being really an understanding. From my perspective,
Mitch McConnell doesn't do anything he doesn't think the White House is going to sign. I want to move on to newly elected Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib, who kind of stole the spotlight from the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and all that, at a reception hours after she was sworn in. She was at a reception. There were microphones. There were people filming it. She was recounting a conversation with her son. Let's roll it.
bullies don't win. And I said, baby, they don't. Because we're going to go in there, we're going to impeach the mother.
Well, I thought her comments were disgraceful. This is a person that I don't know. I assume she's new. I think she dishonored herself, and I think she dishonored her family.
There's been a lot of press coverage of this, naturally, and some are saying, well, President Trump also insults people, so it's okay.
So that would be whataboutism, I think, is the term we've heard so much of. Look, I have seen a number of people on the left trying to work the refs with the press on this issue. Soledad O'Brien, for example, was out on Twitter attacking the media and the New York Times for covering this. And this is
covering
not
it at all.
Yeah,
she's former CNN anchor.
Yes, and she's sort of shown what her ideological stripes truly are since leaving CNN. But to me, I think it's a very simple test. If it were 2010, or 2011 at this point, and there were a newly elected Tea Party freshman who went to a Freedom Works gathering the day of his swearing in and said exactly that sentence about President Obama, would we be having a massive media firestorm about civility and comportment and so on and so forth? And I think the answer undeniably is yes. So I do not think this is being overblown or overcovered. In fact, I think more Democrats should be asked whether or not they support this type of rhetoric.
Well, at least some are being asked. And Rashida Tlaib, who she didn't want to talk to reporters, but she tweeted that she's unapologetic about it. And by the way, the New York Times ran the whole word, the whole MFR word, I believe for the first time in recorded history. But so you had Nancy Pelosi distancing herself, because it's not just the word, but it is the full-throated cry for impeachment.
Right.
Here's a HuffPost headline: GOP suddenly cares about foul language.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, I mean, again, Guy, you're just like killing it this morning. But I mean, I think you're making some very good points. But I think the real story here is not, unfortunately, about this, incendiary language. We have become desensitized to it because it's not 2011. It is, 2019, and President Trump has set the bar in a different manner as far as kind of the language that was used.
Let me jump in on that. So he talks about morons and idiots and so forth, and people say, oh, he called S-hole coaches. That was in a private meeting that was leaked, as opposed to saying it.
Hey, I'm not supporting what she said. I'm not supporting what she said, and I don't necessarily think it's becoming of a member of Congress. But I think the real story here is about someone who is unapologetic about impeachment, who had an op-ed in the Detroit Free Press saying, I'm down with impeachment. But now what the other coverage about this is Pelosi and the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, Jerry Nadler, they're saying, whoa, let's hold off on that. Maybe we shouldn't go that far.
Well, what was interesting is that Nancy Pelosi did an interview with the Today Show just as she's about to reclaim the gavel. And she was asked about impeachment or indictment of a sitting president. And she said, well, it's not conclusive. Let's see what the Mueller report says. Press didn't portray that as an aggressive act. I mean, she's not ruling out either of those things.
Well, she can't, because she's got a base that won't let her. But I know that she doesn't want to do it, and neither do a lot of the chairs of these committees. They want to wait to see the Mueller report. And then what she did say in the interview this morning is that she needed a crescendo of bipartisan outrage over whatever the Mueller report produces. That would inspire her either way, whether to go for impeachment. So she is hedging it very carefully. She can't knock it down entirely the way she did back when she took over the first time as Speaker and Bush was president. Like she did that. So at that time, there was not as much of a strong cry from her base to do that.
All right, and one more soundbite to play here, and this is the president made his first ever appearance in the White House briefing room to make a pitch for his side of the shutdown argument, the wall funding, and so forth. And then he walked off, and this happened.
Thank you.
You're not taking any questions at all.
The point of the briefing room is to take questions.
So the journalists were not happy. By the way, clearly this is a day when Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats were dominating the news, and the president wanted to get into the news. MSNBC anchor Chris Jansen called it an apparent act of desperation that he went to the briefing room.
No, I think it was an act of political messaging where the president has a bully pulpit, which he used. I actually think that particular press conference, you want to call it that media appearance was one of the most effective pieces of media work we've seen from the White House in a long time.
Particularly, but you can't call it a press conference.
No, you can't. I think some of the objections to him not taking questions were overblown because he took lots of questions the day before and the next day as well.
And this morning, and just about every day, he's having a mini press conference. Sometimes it's going on for 45 minutes, so I understand the reporters being frustrated in the moment, but you can't accuse this president of kind of ducking the press.
No, he doesn't. I mean, look how many times, you see these meetings. Look at what he did with Chuck and Nancy just a few weeks back about owning the shutdown and having a lot of those kind of negotiations in open air. He certainly doesn't duck from the press. I do think that this was more about messaging and trying to get the spotlight off of Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats.
Not against the law to go in front of the camera, especially if you're president.